Okay, in this video we're going to talk about type 1 and type 2 errors in statistical testing. No matter what, it is possible that you are going to make an error when you do a statistical test. So here's how I like to think about it. A statistical test is like a jury trial. In a jury trial, we start off with the assumption that the person is innocent. The lawyers then have the task of providing evidence against that assumption. So really, there's two possible outcomes. The person could be convicted, in other words, they're found guilty, or the person could be acquitted, they're found not guilty. Okay, so if the person is actually innocent, unknown to the lawyers, presumably, and we acquit them, that is no error whatsoever. And if the person is actually guilty of the crime and they are convicted, well, that's no error whatsoever. These are the two cases that we would like to be in. But as we all know, there's flaws in the ways that people gather data and provide evidence. So if the person was, say, found guilty and was actually innocent, that's what we call a type 1 error. And if the person was actually guilty and we let them go, we said, well, okay, not guilty, that is called a type 2 error. So let's put this in the language of statistical tests. In a statistical test, our assumption is that there's no effect. That's our null hypothesis. We're assuming that there's no difference between groups, or one group's the same as another, or something like that. Our goal in the statistical process is to find the probability of finding our sample under that assumption. So you either reject the null hypothesis and say, well, our statement of no effect was not true, or we fail to reject it. We say, well, we don't have evidence against it. And it's the same problem. So if the null hypothesis was actually true and we failed to reject it, then we actually did the right thing. If the null hypothesis was actually false and we reject it, then we did the right thing. There's no errors. This is where we'd like to be. But there's some small, non-trivial probability of landing in these other two spots. If the null hypothesis was actually true, but we reject it, we've made a type 1 error. And if the null hypothesis was actually false, and we fail to reject it, we've made a type 2 error. So to solidify this, we've got this little joke here. So for type 1 and type 2 errors, we start off with the assumption in this picture that the patient is not pregnant. That's kind of our statement of no effect. Let's say that the patient actually is pregnant and the doctor just hasn't known this yet, but the doctor finds them to be pregnant. That's a type 1 error. That's what this first picture is depicting. We're assuming they're not. This patient is most definitely not pregnant, but the doctor says, yep, you're pregnant. A type 2 error, we start with the same assumption. We assume that they're not pregnant. Hopefully we're going to do some tests and figure this out. Now this patient is clearly pregnant, but the doctor finds them not pregnant. That's a type 2 error. So I hope, at minimum, this table helps you clarify in your mind what a type 1 and type 2 error is. I always go back to the jury trial because this is something that I know quite well. We can all think about what happens in a jury trial. This is essentially the same thing that you're doing in a statistical test.